Hello, everybody. I'm Marilyn Levin, and I'm from United for Justice with Peace and from the Eastern Massachusetts No Drones Group. We're the main sponsors or organizers of this forum, Dangerous Developments in Modern Weaponry, a forum on the military pursuit of global hegemony. We have 4 panelists, and we're very happy to welcome you all here today. And we also are live streaming this event. So we want to thank Hamuk, who organized the live streaming today. And this will be available. If you look for these green strips over on the literature table here, you'll be able to get the link, and you can tell your friends about it. And you can also see the program afterwards just by going to this link, and there's a password there too. Okay, we are ready to get started. We're very, very pleased to start with 2 students from MIT who are from organizations that are part of the many groups that are co-sponsoring this event. The first person would like to greet you is Connie from Science for the People.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having us, and we're very happy to co-sponsor this event. I represent the Boston chapter of Science for the People. We're part of an international organization that engages in research, activism, and science communication for the betterment of society, ecological improvement, environmental protection, and to serve human needs. And one of the things that Science for the People's history is actually that it's born out of the anti-Vietnam War movement during the late 1960s. And it has been and it was very active between the 60s and the 80s. And in addition to local actions across the country and around the world, also in collaboration and solidarity with other scientists and peoples around the world, we also published a magazine called Science for the People. And part of what we are doing is actually also relaunching the magazine. So the relaunch of the magazine is at magazine.scienceforthepeople.org, whereas our website is on scienceforthepeople.org. And we welcome you to go take a look at it. And actually later on this month, we will relaunch with a magazine called Relaunch of Radical Science. And we look forward to having you consider, the root causes of science and how science can be used for the good of people, but also has been used as tools for oppression in our society. And so we'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Connie. And we now are going to hear from Alonzo from the MIT Students Against War.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to MIT, otherwise known as the Military Institute of Technology, or the Pentagon on the Charles. So as we listen today to the panelists who will be talking about advancements in military technology, I want us to be a little bit aware of where we are, because right now, there might be somebody working on a research project for the Institute for Soldier Nanotechnologies, which MIT runs along with the Army and with industry partners. Or there might be somebody working on drone technologies over at MIT's Lincoln Labs. MIT has, from the beginning, been intimately entangled with the military-industrial complex. This was true on the first day of classes, when it was actually required for students to take military training. It was true during the Vietnam War, when MIT worked on missile guidance systems, and it's true now. And so for that reason, it's vital for there to be a student movement that can push back against this collaboration. And that's why we're starting MIT Students Against War. It's a new group this semester, and we hope to get more people involved and to really build something that can change this institute's participation in the military. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alonzo. It's very exciting that we have these groups at MIT now, because it was a while that it's just the war people that were busy. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to sit down. Tell you what the process is. I'm going to give a little introduction, and then we have 4 panelists, and I'll introduce each of them, and then we'll follow that with a question and discussion period, and we'll ask people to confine their remarks to a minute or so. For the past 17 years, the United States has fought in Afghanistan and Iraq with no end in sight. In Iraq, 4,500 Americans lost their lives, and directly and indirectly, estimated up to 1 million Iraqis were killed and millions displaced. Direct costs were 1.9 trillion. Direct and indirect costs in Afghanistan alone are estimated at over 5.5 trillion. The costs continue to grow, especially the burden of caring for over 1 million US veterans, which is estimated to reach $1 trillion. And that's not even counting the burdens on families and societies. Besides Iraq and Afghanistan, the US is involved in wars around the globe, in Syria and Yemen and Somalia, and finances the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The US has over 800 bases in over 900 countries. And the US outpaces all other nations in military expenditures. World military spending totaled more than 1.6 trillion in 2015, but the US accounted for 37% of the total and spends more on national defense than China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, France, United Kingdom, and Japan combined. With his new proposed budget, Trump takes more than $1 trillion in taxpayer money and disperses fully $750 billion to the military. Out of every taxpayer dollar, that means that 62 cents go to the military and our militarized Department of Homeland Security. 12 billion of this goes to that border wall that we have this crisis with. And veterans benefits takes another 7 cents. So that leaves just 31 cents for all the rest. Health, education, job training, community economic development, housing, infrastructure, safe drinking water and clean air, health and science research, and the prevention of war through diplomacy and humanitarian aid. And if that's not bad enough, this budget cuts billions from non-discretionary funding for anti-poverty programs, Medicaid, food stamps, housing, heating, and job training, at the least. The US has been obscenely prioritizing war and its military since its inception. But now with this administration, it's on steroids. As you listen to the speakers tonight talking about the expansion of dangerous modern weapons, think about the financial costs, what that could do to help people here and around the world, and the costs in human lives, harm to the environment, and potential for existential annihilation, and how we must and can turn this around. I'm going to start with Subrata. We're going to start with Subrata Ghosh-Roy. Subrata is a research affiliate at MIT's program in science, technology, and society. He spent many years as an engineer in the defense industry before joining academia. He was also a professional staff member of the US Congress and later a senior defense analyst at GAO, the investigative arm of Congress. He became a whistleblower after uncovering fraud in the missile defense program. His research includes the military-industrial complex, nuclear weapons, and a nuclear disarmament. He is the co-author of the book, South Asia at a Crossroads, and he's going to start out with an overview of military strategy.
Thank you, Marilyn. I guess I should raise my voice. And thank you everybody for coming to MIT. And I'm glad to see MIT students trying to get organized against war and military research. We have very little time, so I'm going to get right into the topic. How did we get involved in so much into this mess as we find ourselves today with this incredible military budget that Marilyn talked about, and the tremendous amount of weaponry that we build? It all got started during the war, that is the Second World War, in 1945. The Manhattan Project, which included many top physicists from MIT, Caltech, Harvard, Columbia, and so forth, started around 1939, I think, and it ended with the explosion of the first atomic bomb in Alamogordo in 1945, July. And that is what cemented the relationship between the universities and science and the military. I'm going to go a little fast, so sometimes my slides are going to be a little bit off sequence. Part of the reason is also I cannot see very well. So the drive was always from the Second World War with the Manhattan Project, when we got the atomic bomb and the atomic monopoly at that time. And that lasted quite a few years because it took several years for Russia or Soviet Union at that time to catch up and build its own bomb. But so the US was in an arms race with itself right away, building huge number of weapons starting 1945 after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that was what Secretary of Defense Carter, who's Harvard professor, Elaine's colleague, said that was the first offset, meaning we offset the Soviet power by having this nuclear monopoly. But once that was somewhat equalized, then we went on to, of course, into a computer revolution with high-speed electronics and so forth, all funded by the Defense Department. And we call the second offset of precision-guided weapons and so forth. And now we're talking about the third offset, which is the application of artificial intelligence into our weaponry to make it autonomous weapons. And I think Nick is going to talk about that later. So one of the things also is noteworthy is a Manhattan Project that right after the war ended, Vannevar Bush was tasked by President Roosevelt. He was almost dying. Vannevar Bush, you can see his name on a room just up the street here on the Infinite Corridor. He was the vice president for research at, or dean of engineering at MIT at that time. Then he went to Washington to become the director of the Office of Science Technology Policy under Roosevelt. And Vannevar Bush came up with this two-pronged idea that after the war, how do we sustain this economy that is revved up with all the building of the armaments, the aircraft, the ships, the bombs, and the missiles, and so forth? So Vannevar Bush's idea was to continue that path, spend huge amounts of money on defense, and also keep the scientists going at universities to do interesting work. Yes, there is obviously interesting work, even on when you are building weapons. The physics is very interesting, chemistry is very interesting. So it is quite possible, and we're doing it still today, that work is continuing. So we have a two-pronged strategy of that. The industry will hum, economy will hum, and the scientists will get jobs. And this is the compact after the war, and which Eisenhower then called, when he was leaving in 1961, as the birth of the military-industrial complex. And so now we are 75 years or more. It's 55 plus 20, 75 years after the war ended. And now we're in the, and 1991, so it is 18 plus, almost 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And we don't have a so-called peer competitor like we did during the Cold War. But that paradigm that was devised by Vannevar Bush at that time continues today. So massive, massive defense spending that, so this is just a pictorial thing of the budget, and you can see that everything else just dwarfs compared to what the defense spending is. But I would just want to point out that a big part of the defense spending is in the research and development. So this big blue thing here is the science and technology and weapons development in the defense budget of 700 plus billion, and that's the nominal budget. And everything else, like where is climate? We are in a crisis. Where do you think you can find the money for climate? It's very small. It's in NASA and it's in the Commerce, where the National Agency for Atmospherics, NOAA, is situated. And that's supposed to be phased out too. So the crisis is here for people, not for the military contractors. So this huge amount of money. So not only the $700 billion defense budget that supplies all the things in the 800 military bases, makes all kinds of weapons, but the R&D budget is also huge, and it's a real slush fund for the military contractors, because you can do pretty much anything in the name of R&D. And once you have the weapons devised with the taxpayer money, the R&D budget, for which the corporations take no risk. I mean, Uncle Sam is the biggest venture capitalist which do not ask anything back from the people they fund. Can you imagine that the kinds of risks the companies can take is enormous? So out comes outlandish ideas of weapons, and all you have to do is to invent a threat. Then you can build a weapon. And that's the kind of cycle we are in, because the incentives are absolutely wrong that the companies take no risk in devising these weapons. And then it also creates this blind faith in technology. This is a kind of a list I produced on my own about the way weapons are used throughout the history after the Second World War, but primarily after the Cold War. Because the Cold War paradigm is okay, you're still spending a lot of money, but the enemy is not there. So we can do pretty much anything. And so we don't have to abide by any kind of rules internationally, whether it's the UN or anything. We just do whatever we want. We can bomb wherever, we can use whatever kind of weapon, and there is no accountability. We don't have to, it's total impunity with which US military can operate internationally. And we see the impact of that throughout the world. And it's especially true, of course, after the horrific attacks on 9/11 in New York and elsewhere, that we actually have a total carte blanche. So we can use bunker busters, we can use these huge GDAM weapons. We have even a bomb that actually Trump dropped it. It's called the Moab, the mother of all bombs. That's so heavy that it can only be carried by a C-130 plane. And and again, we can just go ahead and do it, drop it anywhere for experiments. There's an interesting thing. I mean, there's all these weapons, but this was interesting. This was a bomb that was dropped supposedly in Iraq during the second invasion of Iraq, and it was called an E-bomb, and it was reported by the press. And the E-bomb is what's known as an electromagnetic pulse bomb. So I knew when I was in Congress that they were developing these. There was a congressman named Roscoe Bartlett from Maryland who was very much into this EMP thing. He was on the Armed Services Committee, a Republican. And so they got to test this out. It's some EMP generator. It's a very short burst of microwaves that can be generated on an airplane, a big airplane we have, of course. And basically like a radar beam just goes and delivers the energy to TV towers or radar installations and can knock them out. But interestingly enough, this also has a nuclear history. Elaine, you'd be interested in this. And the EMP was first detected in 1962 when the test happened over Johnstone Atoll on the Pacific Ocean in 1962, before we signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty and banned all atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons. And there, Honolulu went out after this megaton burst. And I know I was in Japan recently, and the Japanese have a Lucky Dragon. It's a boat that was on the ocean nearby. They didn't get the notice, and many, many Japanese fishermen got irradiated. So the EMP is an effect of the nuclear weapon blast, and so it can do tremendous damage to the power system. And I don't know if this is something they used in Venezuela recently, because the way the power system went out in Venezuela is very, very interesting. But quickly, how much do I have? 3 minutes. Huh? 3 minutes. Okay. Okay. So let me just do that. You heard about this program called Star Wars, which is a very high-tech Star Wars science fiction project that SDI by President Ronald Reagan, 1983. And I was personally involved. So since I really have no time left, so I just go to show what they were proposing, all kinds of space-based stuff. And this is one thing I was involved. This is a PR shot from the Pentagon. It's called the airborne laser. It was a 747 carrying a chemical laser that was supposed to shoot down incoming Russian missiles. And I was in Congress then. I had a special, a confidential report to the House Armed Services Committee saying that this thing is an absolute turkey. It's not going to work because this has not been tested, and you should test it on the ground before going on the air. But Boeing, of course, sold the airplane quickly because 747 is there, the manufacturer, not 737, and this one works. So and they tried to put the laser. And here's what happened. This is the Boeing 747 that should have carried all these incredible laser weapon. To build the laser, you got to make it lightweight and all this stuff. It's a really high-tech system. They couldn't fit anything. They were supposed to be, these red things are laser modules. There were supposed to be 13 of them, ended up putting in only 6, and that even didn't work. So the project was canceled. $5 billion later, no accountability. And this is how they kept the project going. This is Boeing's ABL PR job all across the United States. You have some way of doing some ABL work. So you got all the congressmen and the senators on board from all the states. And so finally, on this note, and we can go into, I really couldn't have cover half of what I wanted to say, but anyway, just the current thing is this plane. It's happening right now. This is called the F-35. It is the crown jewel of the US Air Force, and it is also a complete turkey. It is supposed to be the 5th generation airplane. It's actually not. I was in Japan when I said it a few months ago, and the Japanese are forced to buy a whole bunch of them. One just crashed. And tremendous amount of money in going in. But I just found out that there was 99 Congress members, Democrats, Republicans, asking for more of the plane. So let me just go to my final chart and finish my talk. So we ought to be deeply concerned. I just want to make a couple of points that there's tremendous waste in this business of weapon making because it is so profitable for the companies, and the companies fund the people who run for election. And so it is this nexus, of the military-industrial congressional complex, that we ought to be very careful. Pentagon is not accountable. Its books are not auditable. And this, finally, the thing that is so important for MIT and others is that we at the universities are a very important part of the food chain of these weapon systems. This is where the ideas, the seed corns come and germinate. So we cannot say that we're just doing basic science. We don't contribute to this operation that is taking all our money. I was actually going to put the picture of the black hole that has just been observed. And that is a picture of the defense budget. It is sucking all the oxygen in the room. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes. Our next speaker is Elaine Scarry. She teaches at Harvard, where she is the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics. She's the author of Thermonuclear Monarchy, Choosing Between Democracy and Doom. Wait, let me make
This
sure.
side?
No, let me just see. Right there.
Top, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now go to the escape mode so we can get the whole thing on there.
Okay, and you just do the forward arrow?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just forward. Yeah. Sorry. Go to the backward arrow to go to the next one.
Go the forward arrow?
No, the next. The backward arrow. Down arrow.
Oh,
Yeah, here you go.
Okay.
Okay. Oops. Did I screw it up?
Yeah.
My eyesight is just doing.
Should I just go back? That's
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, Elaine.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I see lots of people who have lots of knowledge here, but I want to particularly say what a pleasure it is to have Sister Megan Rice, who, as you may know, walked 2 hours through the night to get to Oak Ridge, Tennessee nuclear facility, broke through 5 perimeter gates, along with 2 colleagues, and her best friend Pat and her niece and her cousin are here with her. So that's a special pleasure. What scale of object are we talking about when we talk about weapons and weapon production and weapon ingenuity? We might, on the one hand, be talking about something very small, like the physically small, such as the kind of nuclear trigger that might have improvements made in it. Or we might be talking about something relatively vast, like the whole tribe of nuclear submarines. We have, as you may know, 14 Ohio-class submarines. Each one individually has the power to destroy a continent. Earth has 7 continents. The United States has 14 Ohio-class submarines. And I should say that of those 14 submarines, 8 were made, commissioned, and sent out into the oceans following the fall of the Berlin Wall. So after the Cold War ended, they were all built and commissioned in the 1990s. Despite their recent making, we're already, as part of the $1 trillion budget, making 12 new ones. And there's a question about how much about them is really new. The length of the submarine is the same as the Ohio class. The perimeter of the new one, which is called the Columbia class, differs by just 1 foot. The size of the missile tubes is the same, 87 inches. Are they new weapons? It's hard to say. One article published in the Naval Institute Proceedings Journal complains that we haven't in the United States done any new research on nuclear weapons since 1990. And this article worries that we need to keep our talents, our pool of talent exercised. Even if we don't need new nuclear weapons, we might someday in the future. So we ought to be having a whole tribe of very brilliant people working on this, even though we don't need them. Though we aren't working on them, we are certainly replacing them with near equivalents, as in the case of the Ohio submarine replacement by the Columbia submarine that is the first one of which will be completed in 2031 and costs over $6 billion. And the whole program together is estimated to cost between $100 and $600 billion. And there are many examples of this. For example, one kind of new machine that's being contemplated by the Navy is a human agent-free boat that will be a surface ship and will eventually replace battleships. But in order to pay for that, they're taking one of our Air Force carriers, the Truman, that has 25 years left of life left on it, and considering retiring it so that the money that would be spent on refueling it and manning it can instead be put into this. There's this tremendous shuffling that goes about. For many of us in the United States, when we talk about a nuclear weapon, we don't just mean a single weapon. We mean the whole architecture. And this is a quick glimpse of the whole architecture that many of you are familiar with. So for many of us, and you can see that 94% of the weapons are owned by the United States and by Russia, with this tiny wedge owned by the other 7 countries. For many of us, the real opposition is not between US and Russia or US and North Korea, who, by the way, has fewer than 20 missiles, but between the makers and firers of the nuclear weapons and the populations of Earth, between the people who have access to firing these things and the rest of us. What's unique about the nuclear architecture is what happens at either end. The tremendous lack of ratio, the asymmetry between the firing end of the weapon and the injuring end of the weapon. The injuring weapon end of the weapon is unique among weapons for having a catastrophically large number. We know in the recent work on nuclear winter that if even 1/100th of the current, or 1/100th of 1% of the current arsenal is used, 44 million people will die on the first afternoon and 1 billion in the first month. Okay, but the other end of the weapon is equally extraordinary because it has a tiny number of people, 1 person, the president of the United States, or 3 people, the council in another country, or 2 people in another nuclear state that have responsibility for firing this. And this is important because the weapons we have, the anti-nuclear weapons we have at our disposal, the anti-nuclear tools we have at our disposal differ depending on which end you're addressing. International law addresses the injuring end of the weapon. It says it's not legal to commit genocide. It's not legal to use weapons that cause disproportionate suffering. It's not legal to use weapons that cross over the border into neutral countries. It's not legal to destroy the ozone layer. It's not legal to destroy the environment. In contrast, but equally important, are national constitutional laws which address the firing end of the weapon and say it's not legal to have war carried out single-handedly without authorization from the whole population and from Congress, something that I often go into but won't go into tonight. Now, there are 2 new genres of weapon that seem to be designed to eliminating or diminishing injury that we hear a lot about. One is low-yield nuclear weapons. The other is anti-ballistic missiles. And both are sound as though they might somehow entail a diminution of injuring. And yet, as you may know, critics and people on the street in general worry that just the opposite is true, that they actually will increase the dangers because low-yield nuclear weapons let us cross over the nuclear taboo threshold and therefore allow retaliation. And the low-yield weapons occur in all 3 of our branches of the military. For example, the Navy is considering doing a low-yield SLBM missile on its nuclear submarines. Anti-ballistic missiles are also present in all 3 of the branches, and they are, of course, they were prohibited up until 2001 when Bush pulled us out of the ABM treaty. But they claim to intercept, and yet it seems that they are not really capable of doing that. And furthermore, they incite other countries to then get more and more powerful weapons, like the kinds of weapons that Putin has been boasting that Russia now produces. And when we talk about interception of weapons, we ought to remember the model of 9/11. On 9/11, one passenger plane, Flight 93, was brought down by the passengers on that plane in Pennsylvania, who in 23 minutes after learning about the World Trade Towers, deliberated among themselves, literally took a vote, and together brought down the plane, 23 minutes. In contrast, the Pentagon could not protect the Pentagon on 9/11. The Pentagon could not shoot down Flight 77, even though rather than 23 minutes like Flight 93, they had 55 minutes. They had 6 levels of verification. 55 minutes before the Pentagon was hit, they saw that there was a loss of radio. Then 49 minutes before it was hit, loss of transponder. Then 45 minutes before it was hit, loss of contact with the airline company. Then 20 minutes before it was hit, a passenger on the plane calls the Justice Department. Solicitor General Ted Olson's wife was on that plane. She called him and said, I'm on the plane. The hijackers are here. No response. So when we hear for decades about how the military really is going to defend the country by shooting down planes, I don't think so. They could not shoot this down. And the explanation that they give, or one of the explanations they give is, well, there were 11 other planes with transponders off. Now, when you have an incoming missile, there are going to be lots of decoys. And yet, when the tests are done, you don't actually have any decoys being used in the test. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'm particularly grateful to Laura Grego for giving it to me to show you tonight. It shows that from 2000 to 2019, one of our major interceptors, what's called the GMD, which is the Ground Defense Mid-Range Defense Program stationed in Alaska and California, has not improved. It's 50% failure rate in each from each year. Sometimes it's one ahead on the success side, sometimes it's one ahead on the failure side, but it's roughly 50% in each case. This is also a film that, for shortage of time, I won't show you, but you can look at it on the Union of Concerned Scientists website, and it shows the orbiting ABM apparatus for shooting down missiles. And what it makes clear is that with the low orbits that you have to have, if you want to say intercept something coming from North Korea, you can't just have one satellite orbiting. You have to have 30 in that orbit. But because the Earth is also turning, you have to have many, many orbits. And so just to cover the shots coming from North Korea, you need over 300 satellites in the sky. So it's a somewhat crazy system. The Navy also has a lot of talk about whether the Aegis has any success at all, any serious success rate at all in shooting down ballistic missiles. Because I just have a few minutes left, I want to say that I think it's important to see the situation we're in, not just in the perspective of the 21st century or the 20th century, or even the lifespan of the human species, but a much larger span. And that's suggested to me by the fact that I have noticed in talking about nuclear weapons that one genre of people who are passionate about the dangers of nuclear weapons, in my experience, are astrophysicists. And I once asked one of them, the head royal astronomer of Britain, Martin Rees, how come with all these other planets in your purview, all these other stars, all these other galaxies, like the Sombrero Galaxy, which itself contains a billion stars. This photograph, for example, contains over 1,000 galaxies, each of which has billions of stars in it. And many have the planets that seem to have the qualities that should sustain life. I said, why is it that you care so much about what happens on our planet since you're looking out there all the time? And he said that if you have this in your horizon, you care much more because you see how very precious and unique this Earth is. And so far, we have not found any life out there. And there's something that was developed by the scientist Fermi that has been called the Fermi paradox. This was in the last quarter of the 20th century. And the Fermi paradox is how, with millions of planets out there that have the conditions for life, how is it possible that we haven't found life yet? There are various explanations that are given, but I think you can guess what the major explanation is, the most frequent explanation. The most frequent explanation is that any planet which has a species capable of interstellar communication will also be a planet smart enough to blow itself up and has. So we're now in a situation where we're trying to get through the eye of a needle. We need all the ingenuity that exists on Earth. We need all the ingenuity on Earth not to be developing and replicating these weapons, but to doing things like Sebastian Philippe, who's right here, is doing, of finding verification techniques so that we can have treaties for getting rid of weapons. or things like Megan Rice is doing of just going through the perimeter fences. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Before we go on, there's a sign-up sheet that's going to be coming by. Please sign up if you'd like to be on our mailing list and to get notices of future programs that we're running. Thank you. Our third speaker is Nick Motern. He's worked as a reporter, researcher, writer, and political organizer over the last 30 years. He's coordinator of NoDrones.com and originator of the Boycott and Divest Honeywell campaign begun in 2014 because of the firm's involvement in drone war. His articles have appeared in truthout.org since 2008. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. It's really good to see such a crowd here tonight. And I'm sorry I can't bless you with any visual aids. And I'm going to have to read my statement because I want to get everything in and do it in my my allotted time. In this forum, we are discussing dangerous developments in weapons, which I choose to divide into two categories. One is weapons of annihilation, and the other is weapons of repression. And my focus will be on weapons of repression and specifically artificial intelligence as it relates to weaponized drones, which I will refer to as killer drones. I will also speak about the new historic refusal of workers from within the military-industrial complex to do war work. This astounding rebellion was sparked in 2018 by Google workers who objected to creating artificial intelligence software that could and would enable drone killing. The U.S. military has been involved in wars of mass repression, wars to gain control of land and other resources, such as oil, owned by people of color since the founding of the United States. Indeed, the creation of the U.S. was based on an ongoing campaign of genocide against indigenous people. In this campaign and U.S. military repression into the first half of the 20th century, in places like the Philippines and Central America, the U.S. used the same type of weapons that had been used in the large-scale wars between massed armies. However, in Vietnam, the U.S. began for the first time to use sensing devices and computers to gather vast amounts of data about the location and movement of their indigenous opponents, instantly linking this targeting information with aircraft crews who would come in for the kill. The new system, which was dubbed Igloo White, was designed by a group of noted U.S. scientists calling themselves the Jason Group. The purpose was to build an electronic surveillance kill zone at the border of North and South Vietnam that would prevent North Vietnamese soldiers and weapons from moving into the South. Since we are at MIT, I should note that MIT professors Henry Kendall and Steven Weinberg were members of the Jason Group at the time of the creation of Igloo White. For those with technical interest, the electronic border barrier involved a variety of battery-powered sensors dropped from the air that were designed to detect sound, metal, radio signals, the firing of truck ignitions, and human sweat and urine. Drones were also deployed, equipped with optical, infrared, and radar sensors. All the data was fed into a modern 200,000 square foot facility in Thailand, equipped with the most advanced computer equipment of the time, IBM 360 computers with IBM 2260 monitors. The entire Ho Chi Minh Trail operation was displayed in real time, in color, on screens 3 stories high. Igloo White was a military failure against the ingenuity and determination of the North Vietnamese. But that system was developed into what we call today the electronic battlefield. And this was, as was predicted by U.S. Commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, who said in a speech in 1969, "On the battlefield of the future, enemy forces will be located, tracked, and targeted almost instantaneously through the use of data links, computer-assisted intelligence, evaluation, and automated fire control." Westmoreland said he was also impressed by technology's ability to find his North Vietnamese foe, who, he said, is naturally elusive and cunning in his use of dense jungle for concealment, not unlike comments from US military people who were tracking down and slaughtering American indigenous people or North American indigenous people. Shortly, I will speak about the student and general public condemnation of the scientists who enabled the US war in Vietnam. Led in part by Science for the People, one of the groups that were sponsoring this forum, and of course you heard about tonight. The next major leap in US repression weaponry is the use of artificial intelligence and the surveillance and targeting of individuals and groups. This is a development that brings us to where we are today, and I believe this development is extraordinarily dangerous, far more dangerous than the creation of the autonomous weapons themselves, because it is through artificial intelligence and the conclusions drawn with it that AI surveillance and targeting is inserted into the minds, quote unquote, of autonomous weapons. From what I have been able to learn, the primary impetus for artificial intelligence being propelled into current warfare has come from the demands of drone warfare. The first armed US drone attack came on October 7th, 2001, the first day of the US invasion of Afghanistan, and a failed attempt to kill Taliban leader Mullah Omar. However, the stealth, surveillance, and killing capability and the positive political profile of armed drones, which is less boots on the ground, established drones as the weapon in the US arsenal of repression, the leading weapon in the US arsenal of repression. And drone operations expanded quickly and beyond Afghanistan. And although the war on terror, quote unquote, is diminishing, the numbers of drones are increasing and the number of drone bases are increasing inside the United States and around the world. In this country, United States, we now have at least 27 drone control centers. And the closest to here is in Syracuse and Niagara Falls. It became obvious immediately that the huge amount of drone video surveillance footage, plus electronic surveillance and human-gathered intelligence about potential targets, plus the expanding number of potential targets caught on drone cameras, resulted in the need for artificial intelligence to sort, classify, and give priority in selecting people to target. That is, artificial intelligence was and is needed to create kill lists. AI is also creating kill list data through facial recognition systems, and other research offers the potential for even more intrusive violations of personal privacy. For example, an MIT description of MIT Media Lab's Emotion AI project says the program, quote, can listen to voice inflections and start to recognize when those inflections correlate with stress and anger. Machines can analyze images and pick up subtleties and micro expression on human faces that might happen even too fast for a person to recognize. The description notes, however, the obvious complications in coming to human conclusions through machines. Recognizing emotions in an African-American face sometimes can be difficult for a machine that's trained on Caucasian faces. And some of the gestures or voice inflections in one culture may mean something very different in a different culture, unquote. In considering the vastness of the AI drone data demand, we must recognize not only the pressure to add more and more indicators of threat from indigenous people. We must remember that kill lists are almost certainly being created continuously for every nation over which the US operates killer drones. At this moment, these nations are publicly known to include Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Niger, and the Philippines. And we must include other nations in which Western extraction companies have operations or ambitions, such as Sudan. MIT's Lincoln Laboratory appears to be one of the institutions working on AI technology needed to address the monumental data collection and sorting demands of a Pentagon that seeks global reach for its repressive weaponry. Lincoln Lab's website says of its intelligence and design technologies program, quote, "We research technologies for processing, exploiting, and integrating data collected from diverse sensors such as radar, electro-optic, video, radio frequency, as well as from people on and the internet." This type of Pentagon research came under a category called Project Maven that brought the first rebellion of Google workers against doing war work. Resignations and refusals caused Google to drop Project Maven in June 2018. In October, continued resistance within Google caused them to pull out of a bid to build a $10 billion AI brain for the Pentagon. This would be a targeting brain, and it was dubbed Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, or JEDI. Amazon and others stayed in the bidding, and the Pentagon announced last week that Amazon and Microsoft are the two finalists for the JEDI contract. This brings us back to MIT, where a member of the board of directors of Amazon, Dan Huttenlocher, has been appointed dean of the new College of Computing that will be set up at MIT. And there has been criticism of this because of that conflict of interest. We know, thanks to Alonso's appearance tonight, that MIT Students Against the War has formed. And one of their major concerns is that the College of Computing will be used primarily towards supporting upgrading Pentagon AI capabilities. I want to get just very briefly into the question of what is the standard of conduct for research? Where should researchers go? The rebellion at Google forced the company to come up with a set of principles for AI work within Google. It includes a pledge not to work on, quote, weapons or other technologies whose principal purpose or implementation is to cause or directly facilitate injury to people. This would include death, presumably. Another set of ethical principles for AI work has been issued by the University of Montreal. And the first principle is that, quote, "The development and use of artificial intelligence systems must permit the growth and well-being of all sentient beings." This does not explicitly prohibit weapons work, as does the Google standard. A more forceful demand that scientists not be involved in weapons research was born out of the atrocity and suffering of Vietnam. It was made in 1972 by authors of, quote, "Science Against the People," a report on the Jason Group that was prepared by scientists and engineers for social and political responsibility based in Berkeley, California. The last page of that report contains also a logo for Science for the People. The author of that report said, "What we say to the Jason scientists is cease all your services to the Pentagon, repudiate the US militaristic policies and corruptions of science in that service, reveal whatever information, inside information you may have about the military. The question we must ask is, what principles does MIT have for its work on artificial intelligence, and indeed all of its research? This is an extremely challenging question because according to MIT's 2018 financial report, the school gets over half of its research funding from the Pentagon. In 2018, that was about 1.09 billion for war-related research, and of that, that was out of 1.7 billion for all research done at MIT. Most of the Pentagon money, which was 966 million, went to Lincoln Laboratory. On-campus research was from the military, $123.5 million. Overall, Pentagon research spending amounted to just under 1/3 of MIT's total operating income. For the whole school, $3.6 billion. About one-third of that comes from the Pentagon. So I have some other points that I wanted to make about the psychology of these weapons, but I think I can speak about that later. But I think that we're in a time when the world is going to have to choose war and repression or cooperation to deal with global warming. The principles for the use of artificial intelligence that are adopted by artificial intelligence researchers, those principles of operation are going to tell us a lot about what direction humanity will be taking. The question I would conclude is, will MIT take the same pledge as Google? Will they respond to the Vietnam War challenge? Will they say, no work on war, no work on killing? Thank you.
Please remember to sign up on to get on our mailing list and to continue sending it around. We have one final speaker. His name is Bruce Gagnon, and he's the co-founder and coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. After growing up in a military family and serving in the Air Force during the Vietnam War, he's an active member of Veterans for Peace and has spent the last 40 years working in the peace and social justice movement. He hosts radio and TV shows in Maine, where he lives currently, and publicizes a blog called Organizing Notes.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here with you all. Thank you for inviting me. The Global Network was created in 1992 and is headquartered today in Brunswick, Maine, where I live. Our website, in case you're interested, is spaceforpeace.org. Military satellites today coordinate all warfare on the Earth. They direct virtually everything the Pentagon does, and they're linked to ground stations all around the planet. So as the satellites orbit the Earth, they're bouncing signals off the ground stations back to the satellites and back to the United States, all in real time, split-second time. And it was in these countries where these ground stations are located, emerged peace groups that became the membership of the Global Network when we created it in 1992. The Persian Gulf War in 1991 was the first space war. In the days before the war began, the United States, with its military satellites, pre-identified all of Saddam Hussein's military targets. And in the first 2 to 3 days of the war, bombed 95% of them. And then played cat and mouse with the remaining 5% of the capability during the remaining weeks of the war, where they essentially field tested the entire US space-directed warfare program. The Yugoslavia war during the Clinton administration was the second space war, where again a field test took place. The United States and NATO bombed the living hell out of Yugoslavia, and they were able to do it because with cyber technology, for the first time, they essentially crawled inside of Yugoslavia's air defense system, shut it down, and they could not defend themselves at all. And so no US NATO warplanes were lost during those attacks. Even the Chinese embassy was hit by the United States in a very provocative move. The United States saying, oh, I'm sorry, we were using old maps, which of course was utter bullshit. Depleted uranium was used in Yugoslavia, and today in significant parts of Serbia, there are massive cancer problems amongst the people in many, many places. And this stuff's going to be around for thousands and thousands of years. During the George W. Bush administration, I listened to C-SPAN one evening and heard a speech by a man by the name of Thomas Barnett. He was introduced as Donald Rumsfeld's strategy guy. At that time, he was the Naval War College instructor in Rhode Island. And he had written a book called The Pentagon's New Map. That evening, he said, we are not going to do international treaties anymore because they will restrict our ability to dominate the world. And so we're going to withdraw from treaties. Security export, he said, will be America's role under corporate globalization. We're not going to make things anymore. We're just going to make war and send our children to endless war. And so during that Bush administration, he withdrew from the ABM treaty that outlawed these so-called missile defense systems that are really the shield to be used after a first strike attack is launched on Russia or China. The Iran nuclear deal, we've walked away from that. Recently, the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, PAROS, the prevention of an arms race in outer space. Russia and China have been going to the UN for the last 20 years, every year, begging the United States to join them in creating a global treaty to ban weapons in space. Let's close the door to the barn before the horse gets out. And the US refuses through Republican and Democrat administrations. The official position of the United States is, hey, there are no weapons in space. We don't need a treaty. Russia and China have been telling the United States for at least the last 10 years that because of your missile defense deployments surrounding our country with this so-called shield, we can't afford to reduce our retaliatory capability anymore. You know, Russia and China both have a no first use policy. The United States refuses to develop or to announce such a policy. And so Russia and China are saying, arms control negotiations, we'd love it, but we can't do it as long as you're encircling us with an expanding steroidal NATO operation. And just in the last 2 years, the United States has built launch bases in Poland and Romania for these missile defense systems that will also be able to fire first strike attack nuclear capable cruise missiles that will be able to reach Moscow in 10 to 12 minutes. So what kind of incentive does that create for Russia and China when the United States is ramping up these kind of first strike technologies in their neighborhood, if you will? Where I live in Brunswick, right next door is Bath Iron Works, where they build destroyers. And these Aegis destroyers that are built there are outfitted with these so-called missile defense systems. In fact, on April 27th, just in a few days, there'll be another christening of another destroyer at Bath Iron Works. And I've been helping to organize a protest and nonviolent civil disobedience at this shipyard coming up very soon. In the 1990s, the U.S. Space Command, headquartered in Colorado Springs, Colorado, came out with a planning document called Vision for 2020 that said the United States will control space, dominate space, and deny other countries the use of space. That our job at the Space Command will be full spectrum dominance. We will dominate conflict on the ground with our troops, in the oceans with our Navy, in the air with our Air Force, and in space with our Space Command, all for corporate interests here on Earth, for US corporate interests. I would suggest resource extraction corporate interests. But it's not just Earth that they want to dominate. In a congressional study in the late 1980s entitled Military Space Forces, the Next 50 Years, a congressional staffer laid out a plan for controlling outer space as well. He talked about the Earth-Moon gravity well. Think of a wishing well. If someone is down inside the bottom of a well and you're at the top, you can control their ability to get out because gravity is on your side, you're at the top of the well. In this study, they say with armed space stations on either side of the moon, the United States would be able to control the pathway, the gravity well on and off the planet Earth. And a quote from that book that I've long ago memorized, with military space forces lying in wait at that location, we could hijack rival shipments upon return. So they're already thinking about the day when the corporations can go out and mine the sky. They say on the moon, there's helium-3, there's water. On Mars, there's magnesium, cobalt, and uranium. There's gold on asteroids. And during the the Obama administration, they passed a bill in Congress and Obama signed it, allowing corporations and individuals in the United States to make land claims on planetary bodies, violating the Moon Treaty, violating the Outer Space Treaty at the UN that say no one, no individual, no corporation, no country can make land claims on these planetary bodies, that space and the planetary bodies are the province of all humankind. So this recent Space Force announcement then would give these corporate interests control of the Earth through the US Space Force. This is their vision. It's provocative, it's expensive. The Pentagon has long said that Star Wars, a generic term for all of this, will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. And some years ago, in one of the industry publications called Space News, they said, you know, we have to be responsible corporate citizens and come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all of this, and we have. And they said, we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that dedicated funding source. And they called it the entitlement programs that officially in America are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the social safety net that Bill Clinton began the destruction of during his tenure in office. These are the programs that the military-industrial complex has identified for defunding to pay for all of this stuff. Also controlling, of course, again, the Space Force. One of its jobs would be to control the pathway on and off the planet for corporate interests. So all of this, drones, AI, Space Force, it reveals a corruption of international law, disregard for human life, and most importantly of all, I think, for us as American citizens, a death of the soul of America. What does it say about our soul? What does it say about us as people that we starve our children in order to control and dominate the planet on behalf of corporate interests, and now even prepare to move off the planet into deep space to control universe, essentially, for these same corporate interests? Military spending is drowning out human and environmental needs at a time when our largest problem on this planet is climate change. We must convert the military-industrial complex. And when we're protesting at Bath Iron Works on April 17th, this is going to be our major theme. Right now, we're running a campaign across the state, a petition campaign, a letter writing campaign to newspapers around the state, a congressional visitation, and reaching out to environmental groups, all trying to promote this idea of win, win, win. The conversion of the military-industrial complex is a win-win-win for labor unions, because studies at UMass Amherst Economics Department and Brown University show that if we convert the military-industrial complex, we get more jobs building commuter rail systems, offshore wind turbines, solar power, tidal power, etc. So the labor unions benefit, peace community benefits, the environmental community benefits. So why in all of our work are we not working together, creating a common unifying demand? Convert the military-industrial complex, deal with our real problem, climate change. Thank you very much.
That was really a terrific program so far. And we will open it up in a minute for questions and comments. And I ask that you keep that brief so that we can have a lot of discussion here. I want to encourage you to come up and look at the various groups have literature on the table up in front. Please sign our mailing list. And I want to announce a very important program that's coming up that's sponsored by United for Justice with Peace and many other organizations. We all know that one of the biggest threats of war right now is directed at Venezuela. And the propaganda machines coming from Washington and the media are presenting a totally false narrative of what's going on there. Recently, there have been delegations of people going to Venezuela very recently who are back now and want to tell the story of what they actually saw and what's going on in that country. And it's very important that we counter the narrative that that's being shoved down our throats. In Boston, speakers who've been to Venezuela will be speaking on May 2nd at Encuentro 5 at 7 p.m. There are flyers on the table, I believe, and going around. So we'd love for you to come to that. Okay, we're going to start with questions, discussion. Raise your hand and please keep it brief. And you can ask a general question or direct it at one of the panelists. Oh, I'm sorry, you do. You have to come up and use this microphone, which will be up there. If someone can figure out how to do it. There you go.
I just wanted to ask Subrata a little bit more about this EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapon that he referred to, but I don't think he really explained. Although it was discovered in association with nuclear explosions, they've developed a way of generating it totally independent of nuclear explosions. And what it does is you can focus in on a specific piece of electronic equipment and generate a high current in it and burn it out. And there's a lot of speculation that that's what they did in Venezuela to cause the massive blackouts in Venezuela. And I wanted to see if he could say anything more about that.
I think that, first of all, it was a very, very secretive program that nobody knows about because it leaves no imprint. There are no collateral damage, so to speak, and you fry out electronics. But it is somewhat like a magnetron, I would imagine, which is in everybody's microwave oven and was invented during the Second World War for radar. And so it has power, and in frequencies like about 3 gigahertz or so, at which like the missile defense radar operates, there's a lot of energy because the frequency is very high. And so you can direct quite a bit of energy into a narrow space to burn out electronics. If I may take one more second, Marilyn, is that, and maybe I'll get another chance, there are several weapons that I didn't get a chance to mention that are being developed now as a sequel of the old Star Wars. The man who ran the Star Wars research and development 40 years ago is Michael Griffin. Michael Griffin also happened to be the director of NASA, administrator. He is in charge of R&D. And by 2023, he is planning to put all kinds of stuff in space. All of the things were discredited during the Star Wars effort in 1983 to 1991. But the Star Wars warriors are not dead. They're back. And they want to spend a lot of money. And it is very dangerous, even though many of these weapons don't work.
Excuse me, I selected this man.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I'll be pointing to you.
I have a general question about North Korea. What was the strategy? Why is it so much in the media about a fear with North Korea? So whoever wants to answer. And that if I could just put a quick plug for I'm one of the persons who went to Venezuela in November, December of this year. And if you have any questions in that matter, please come up to me after the talk.
I remember after one North Korean missile test, I read in Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine, U.S. military personnel were laughing at it and saying, they don't even have the satellites where they can even track their launch from beginning to end. We did. They're a chump bunch. They don't have any capability whatsoever. I've always seen the North Korea thing as a facade in order for the U.S. to justify, by scaring the American people in the world, for the U.S. to justify the encirclement of Russia and China with more military technologies. So that's really what's going on. NATO has now become a global alliance. It's forming partnerships with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, other countries. So NATO is going global. And the reason why is because the United States doesn't want to go to the UN anymore and ask for permission before it invades someone. By creating NATO as a global alliance, they then can say, well, we have NATO. It's an international alliance now. We have the permission of our allies to go do these things. So North Korea is just a foil.
I should say about North Korea that the original Trump verbal assault on them, and it's probably still true, that global Hawk drones are very huge, like an airliner, were deployed to fly over North Korea to gather information, as well as U-2. And there was also information that the Army had deployed some smaller killer drones into that area. And we have to understand that there is this whole notion of preemptive attack that's become really almost a standard, originating in a very structured way within the Israeli Secret Service, as assassination as a matter of constant tactic and strategy. There's a book, Rise and Kill First, that is really almost a blueprint for this. And so when we see the head of Venezuela being, frightened by drones, we have to understand that it's perfectly within the capability of this government to use drones to try to kill leaders of other countries, and that would probably include the leader of North Korea. So we're operating on a very, very dangerous level with this technology that seems to give us omnipotence, and that's really probably one of the most dangerous parts of this, is that we might feel that we could use drone assassination to solve a nuclear problem.
And I'll just add a word on North Korea. If you remember the figure that North Korea has 20 missiles or fewer, some people do put it as high as 60, but the most reliable estimates from the Federation of American Scientists says 20 or fewer, as opposed to what we have, 6,500. The second thing to know is that in 1995, 78 countries went to the International Court of Justice, pleading with the court to declare nuclear weapons illegal. And many countries testified. Included among the litigants were two countries that did not yet have nuclear weapons, North Korea and India. And each of them said, if the court cannot declare these illegal, we have to get them just to defend ourselves. Indeed, North Korea and India shortly thereafter did have to get nuclear weapons. The third thing to know, if we had Mike Van, how do you pronounce Michael's last name? Van Elzica here, he would be able to remind us what North Korea suffered during the Korean War, where more napalm was dropped than, as Mike often says, than in much more than in Vietnam, and where even, and I'm again quoting Mike, where even Churchill said this was not meant to be just splashed around on citizens the way it was. So they got nuclear weapons, as the leader of that country repeatedly says, in order to stop the threat that they would be wiped out completely.
You and then you.
Okay, my question is, am I coming through? Yeah. What are the chances and or likelihood of a computer system being hacked and starting a launch of a nuclear attack?
So one thing to keep in mind is that our F-35, which is a 90% digitized plane and is made to drop free fall nuclear weapons, was hacked into a few years ago. And during the year in which it was hacked into, it was one of 18,000 hacking incidents in the federal government. Now, that the others were not to any of our nuclear bombers. However, it's a reminder of the danger and the possibility of hacking. But one other thing, we talk a lot about the danger of hacking, the danger of terrorists. This nuclear arsenal with thousands of steps involved was not put in place by terrorists. It was not put in place by hackers. So who are the people who made this available to hackers and to terrorists? That's the first question we should be asking ourselves.
Hi, Jonathan King from the Peace Action and the faculty newsletter. I came in late, but I don't believe Saudi Arabia was on the agenda. So as many people here know, MIT is in bed with the Saudi monarchy, military dictatorship. It's true, it's not the new generation of weapons, but they're raining down on Yemen, killing thousands of women and children, innocent people. And though there's very strong resistance in the faculty, students, graduate students, MIT has refused to divest. We have a letter to the corporation to be signed by anybody who is on the faculty, student, or alum. And I'm going to put the URL on the board. You can go to that site and you can sign the letter. And when the corporation meets at graduation time, we're going to deliver the letter with hundreds of signatures. So thank you.
Hi, my name's Robin Clemens. Sorry, my voice is a little scratchy. I have a bit of a cold. My name's Robin Clemens. My question is to you guys. Have you ever tried to get a petition circulating with professors at Harvard and MIT to sign on to disengage from the military industrial complex? Like to, and my question is, have they ever got a petition for the professors at Harvard and MIT, hopefully pass it around to all the professors, to disengage from the military industrial complex? Or are they too financially enmeshed to make that a reality?
A very good person. Jonathan, that's a great question for you to answer.
This is the 50th anniversary of the March 4th, 1969 Scientists Strike for Peace, where scientists on this campus and about 30 other campuses around the country stopped work for a day to protest. At that time, there was a militant campaign to get divestment of what was then called the Instrumentation Lab, now the Draper Lab. It was successful. Draper Lab is building weapons independently, not teaching students. Over the years, that has died down significantly. There was a strong effort around divestment from corporations doing business with apartheid South Africa. And of course, then there was a revival of student concern over fossil fuel with a very, very engaged group here at MIT. They ran into they didn't run directly into David Koch, but he's sitting on the corporation because that's one of the reasons why we're still in bed with Saudi Arabia. But if you ask, could we get our faculty to call for general divestment? Right now, we're just trying to get our faculty to say, get out of bed with Saudi Arabia. But that certainly would be a next step.
I just add one point, and that is there were two, Jonathan mentioned the protests in 69, which resulted in the divestment of the instrumentation lab. And the second one was during the Star Wars, which I had mentioned in 1980s. And many faculty and grad students, postdocs protested the Star Wars. And there was a commission set up by the president. It was called Professor Feshbach. I mean, he was the chair, Professor Hermann Feshbach, the Nobel laureate physicist. And Feshbach Commission's report, which I have been repeatedly bringing it up, that this is a unique opportunity for students who are organizing at MIT. We have a commission report dating back to the 1980s. The report is not really easily available, but it calls for a serious look and a discussion within the university about the university's ties to the Pentagon. It's a deep concern to the commission and the people that were writing that report. And they say that we must have at the least some transparency about the kind of research MIT professors are doing on campus, not just Lincoln Laboratory. And I think the students who are organizing should pick that up as an issue, because here we have something to work with.
I just want to add something that I think is appropriate in the sense that the students here will go to Amazon, Google, Microsoft, IBM, and a number of others. And I want to just say that between June 2018 and today, we have the Google protest against Maven. We have the Amazon employees who wanted Amazon to stop selling its facial recognition to ICE and to the police. We had in August the Tech Workers Coalition circulating a petition calling for Microsoft, IBM, Amazon, and Google to say no more military projects. In October 2018, Google dropped its bid for the Jedi Brain. Microsoft workers urged Microsoft not to bid for the Jedi contract. Microsoft employees demanded dropping an army in February 2019. Microsoft employees demand that it drop an Army contract for augmented reality headsets. In March 2019, a woman with the help of the ACLU made a public statement of why she quit a company called Clarify. And Amazon workers in April demanded that Amazon work harder against climate change. So this kind of movement that you're talking of, that was suggested with this letter to these faculty members, would be very appropriate within this context of ferment going on among people who obviously have graduated from MIT and similar institutions.
Yes, since we're remembering certain events that can, I suppose, serve as templates for our own actions or inspirations, another source is to look at, which you can see online, a 5-part documentary called Have You Heard from Johannesburg, made by Connie Fields. It is a brilliant documentary that covers all kinds of protests that, if you were part of them, you might not feel that they could have done much. Gatherings at this university or that university, sports protests about it and so forth. And yet the thing is overwhelming in the footage that's there and in the model of distributed protest. One whole episode is devoted to Polaroid right here in Cambridge near MIT, when 2 workers realized that the Polaroid photographs were being used for the pass photographs required of Blacks in South Africa. And both the trouble that they were subjected to, they were not greeted kindly by the company, but the eventual momentum that was created by that. And in a way, it's a kind of precedent for some of the facial recognition stuff that now is happening through other sources.
Okay. Are all these people wanting to speak and ask questions? Okay. Pardon me? Okay, I'm not going to call on everybody in order. Some people have had their hands up earlier, and I wanted to choose. So, Linda, you can go next. Yeah.
Okay, many of my questions have already been answered that were directed to pushing this movement that seems to be coming within the universities again. And I just want to say, I feel this is a historic meeting because in the 60s, MIT was a driving force between the movement against the war in Vietnam. I was here during that period. There were 1,000 students meeting at MIT in the plazas, having huge mass meetings against the war in Vietnam. And I think if we have that kind of vision and goal in our minds, that we can do that. If you want the faculty to begin to speak out, you start with the students. And we can start with a student, maybe network on the campuses. Maybe a conference would help to draw this, what I feel is an uptick in anti-war activity. The problem being that the two major parties, this discussion is off limits. You cannot discuss the military budget. None of the candidates, Democrat or Republican, are going to be doing it. So we have a big opportunity in the next election to address that. And I'm wondering if you see the uptick, any of you, that I'm thinking, that I'm witnessing, because I think we've got to run with it.
I'm choosing someone else first.
Yeah, could you respond? I really want to hear, do you see something?
No, I definitely think that there is I wouldn't call it a movement, but I was very, very surprised and pleased to see the turnout at the anti-Kissinger protest when Kissinger came to keynote the opening of the Schwarzman Computing Center, which was built with $300 million of his grant. So Alonzo was one of the major organizers of that. The rally happened in front of the MIT main building, in front of the student center. I was one of the speakers, and many other very good people talked. So I was quite thrilling. So I think there is something is happening. So I'm wondering also what's going on in other campuses. And I was asking Elaine about Harvard, and not much is happening there yet. But I think, as you said, that the engineering schools, even though they are less political in many ways, sometimes could be the harbinger of these things, because they are so intimately involved with the kind of technology that we are developing for the wars.
Okay. You had your hand up for one thing. You need to come up here.
Can you guys turn off your cameras first? No.
It's live stream.
I'll speak really loud.
No, you'll need to come to the mic.
No, he doesn't want to be in the camera.
Yes, yes. People can still hear me, yes. All this talk of the technology developed, and we can't, going over the history that we've already exhibited before. You guys say, these walks are going to solve anything. I think, if you're smart enough, I don't think any of these protests or things are going to stop it. It has always shown that humans will pursue more technology, more war, and I think the question which needs to be proposed is more so, what are the great minds of this world and country willing to do before this assured destruction is coming? Because to be honest, they keep pushing for AI, keep pushing for more. It's more so, it's not even more so, can it be created? It seems that it's going to be, regardless, they always push for more. So the question I want to know is, what are the minds doing to preemptively prepare for what is coming?
I think the one thing that's very different right now from history of modern warfare is that we have many, many more women involved with technology right now. And within these, Google and Microsoft, we've passed out, pamphlets about this very thing to Google workers. Are you going to work on weapons? And many of the women going in there take our flyers. And I think if you say, do more men or women take them, I would say it might be more women take them. And so the preparation that I see for a revolutionary change in weaponry in war is to make sure that women are definitely engaged in conversation about all of these things in a very significant way, because as we see in the Congress, the women who got elected and who are willing and have the courage to speak out are bringing change in public thinking. So rather than prepare for the catastrophe, I think that we should look toward that kind of engagement and realize that this is something new in the history of warfare as we know it.
I would also say that first of all, I believe strongly that the kind of precedents that have been cited here did have a big effect. And again, I would just direct your attention in addition to the have you heard from Johannesburg. And I believe strongly that if people turned out by hundreds of thousands in Washington, this could be reversed very quickly. But I want to also say that in addition to civilian protests, there's another place where you can see the power of group action. We used to have a draft. We used to have soldiers. We now have weapons that don't require human beings. So it's all under executive control. But when weapons were under control, distributed to the soldiers, they often shut the war down, and it's just not reported because we don't like to ever have it be known that soldiers have a free will. So we all know that in Vietnam, soldiers defected, that they deserted. In 1971 alone, 30,000 soldiers deserted. In the recent Iraq War, in 1 year, 2004, within 1 year, 2,000 soldiers deserted. We didn't hear about it. Within the next year, within the first 6 months, the number doubled. 4,000 deserted. And the Department of Defense took it off their website. But if you go back through war after war, you'll find that's true. For example, at the end of World War I, Churchill wanted to take soldiers into Russia to stand with the whites against the red. The soldiers said, we're not going. There were soldier strikes all over England. We don't hear about them. And in Canada and in India. Churchill wrote to Lloyd George and said, I want to take the soldiers into Russia, but I can't. They won't let me. And if you go back to the Civil War, it's well known. We read it in James Scott's Weapons of the Week, but we also read it in a magnificent historian from the 1920s, a woman named Ella Lon, about the way in which desertion on the part of Southern soldiers let the North win in the Civil War. 250,000 soldiers on the Southern side said, we're not doing it anymore. When you read the dispatches of Robert E. Lee, he writes, 25 more soldiers deserted today, 100 more soldiers deserted today. I looked behind me and there was no one there. The military has to know no one is behind them, but they can't know that anymore because their weapons fire without us, so we have to stand in front of them.
That would stop the development of artificial intelligence. People standing created. Also, they can't really be stopped.
That's not true.
No, I'm saying, do you think that would stop the superpowers from trying to develop AI? Is what I'm saying. Do you think that would actually stop? Is what I'm.
Well, I want to dig in.
They're race to it.
1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Excuse me, I have a question. and a fear to express. The question is directed to Elaine Scarry, and she began answering it. My chief fear is ideological, and that is that the techniques that are available today that promote the neoliberal agenda, that destroys our essential humanity. So my fear is the normalization of and the adjusting of the human mind to the idea of nuclear warfare. And how does one prevent that? In other words, how does one prevent people from thinking this is the norm? What can be done?
Well, I can just say that, I mean, I think that a lot of what we're saying tonight are attempts to begin to answer that. But one thing that's very clear to me is that often it's young people from other countries that still see the tremendous danger of nuclear weapons. Very often when I find somebody at Harvard who's very responsive to what one of us is saying, will turn out that he's from the Netherlands. Sebastian Philippe is from France. Probably others of you who are here tonight are from other countries. For some reason, there's been a deadening of the American ability to hear this and to think symmetrically. We think so asymmetrically, as in the case of North Korea. That's a very inadequate answer, but it's just to say your question is important, and it needs all of us to be trying to think of solutions.
Human beings were capable of anything, is what I'm saying,
Yeah.
and the human mind.
Yeah, well, we have to pivot it in a better direction. Okay, we're going to hear from everybody in this row, and then that'll be it for tonight. So try to keep your comments brief. Did you want to say something, Sabrina?
Yeah, I was just going to say that on the question of nuclear weapons and the public participation in their decisions and so forth, I don't think there is a normalization that people just feel nuclear weapons are normal, they will be used. I think what people don't think about it, nuclear weapons are not part of our conversation, even though we are embarking on a $1 trillion expansion of the nuclear weapons complex. It is not in the public debate. Nobody's talking about it. So I think the first job is to bring it into public debate.
I'd like to put something else on the table. And I'll just start by saying, you say we are pursuing an agenda of global dominance, what we used to call full spectrum dominance. It seems we ought to be looking into exactly who the we are, the we in quotes. I am certain this we does not include either myself or most of my neighbors. I believe we need to understand who exactly are the we people that are pursuing this insane weapons and murder cycle. And to this, we need to have invincible courage. Till we do this, we will just be spinning our wheels in denial and fear. This cycle serves to be a war agenda that includes French Revolution, Russian Revolution, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, etc. Looks like a war agenda against humanity, which is asleep. Humanity is asleep while this war agenda is happening. And I'd like to say that Trump and Pence are not the beginning of this war agenda. This has been going on for decades, maybe millenniums. So I just like to put this idea on the table that we nail down who's doing it, because I'm sure that there's specific people involved and that they should be held accountable, and that we should notice them and say, stop. Until we do that, we just continue in this war agenda, and it gets worse and worse. So anyway.
Okay. Okay, so I see a lot of people who are presumably involved with the New Left back in the day and the various student protests that went on, where there was a sort of discontent, as that's also expressed here tonight, that say war is, violating like it goes against, there are various liberal humanitarian concerns being violated with these sort of wars that don't really seem to have any purpose. And so the New Left was able to make strides, like say topple a government in France with these sort of concerns. And so, but then the New Left fizzled out in the 70s. And so the New Left grows up nowadays. And so we have you guys. And so you guys have become our politicians who are currently in Congress, say some Democrats, some Republicans, and some who are, say, apolitical and inherit the sort of distrust of electoralism from your student days. And so it seems that we have not really gotten past the New Left with the sort of concerns that are raised on the table with regards to, say, being against war as such. And I want to reiterate the question I think you posed, which is, is the politics for advancing, say, going against war in good faith? Like, how can we do it currently? I know there's a distrust of electoralism, but if there's anything the last, say, 50 years since 1969 has told us, it's that, say, abandoning politics, like, say, with a sort of perennial protests or, say, community politics hasn't got us 1 inch closer to, say, addressing these concerns. Thanks.
My question pertains to the so-called low yield, or as they're sometimes referred to, tactical nuclear weapons. I was just hoping that 1 or 2 of these panelists could speak more on those. In particular, I'm very concerned about the conflict which seems to be used for electoral politics and to further electoral gains between India and Pakistan, in India in particular, because all war plans that the Pakistani government has for India include the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Any serious escalation, and that could very quickly lead to large-scale nuclear war. I was hoping the panelists could just comment on those and speak on those a little more. Thank you.
I'll just say that I think there's a lot of hype about these nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan. And Bill Clinton started this saying South Asia is the most dangerous place on earth or whatever. South Asians are not suicidal. I mean, yes, India has nuclear weapons and Pakistan does. And obviously Pakistan is hopelessly outnumbered by conventional forces of India. So they are more threatened and maybe in their war plans. But all these things were really sort of made in Washington. This is all made in Washington in terms of putting in this nuclear bogey in South Asia. So now we can all control these places. So not that I'm totally belittling the problem is, but India's getting the nuclear weapons was a prestige thing. I actually met one of the prime ministers, he's passed away now, and he told me that we were looking at the United Nations Security Council and walked past the chamber. Who are the members? And in order to become a member of the Security Council, this is what we have to do. So we have been holding this off in 74 and did it. But it is obviously that there are issues in terms of potential use, and we have to be worried about them. But like here, nuclear weapons are not part of the conversation in India as well. There is an election going on now. Nobody's talking about nuclear weapons. And another thing I will throw that why I think there's a lot of hype about this, if you look at the kind of money that these countries can able to muster for nuclear weapon production, it's minuscule to what we need to actually have a real nuclear arsenal.
This is just a quick sort of political statement. We had a nice technologically eye-opening experience tonight, and plus a sweep of history from 1950. And since 1950, we've had 2 political parties who conceptualize the weapons, they invest in the weapons, they charge the citizenry through taxes for the weapons, and they use these weapons in war, and it's continuing into the 2018, 19, 20, 21. There is one political party in Massachusetts, one of 4 that's acknowledged in Massachusetts, recognized by the state as a major political party, and it's the Green Rainbow Party. And it's the only party that is in the state that has as a fundamental value of our 10 key values, nonviolence. So that leads us to non-military spending, non-invasions of countries. It takes us down a much better path than the past 70 years have brought us by the two standard political parties. We got to break free of that party system. Thank you.
So those of us who've been looking at the publicity for this event have seen the rods from God. I wonder if, Bruce, you might want to tell us a little more about those.
Well, I would go back to the introduction of the Nazi rocket scientist after World War II in the United States, Operation Paperclip, when 100 members of the Nazi rocket team that created the V-1 and V-2 rockets were brought to the United States to build the U.S. space program. And one of them was Major General Walter Dornberger, who was Hitler's liaison to Wernher von Braun, his top rocket scientist. And Dornberger testified before the Congress in the 1950s, saying that, gentlemen, I didn't come to this country to lose the Third World War. I lost 2 already. And he made the case that we have to have orbiting battle stations in space. And so today they're working on this orbiting battle station called Rods from God that would have tungsten steel rods that would essentially drop down from space to the Earth, and it would be part of the U.S. First Strike Attack program, that it would help take out Russian and Chinese underground nuclear missiles and other such, their ground stations, command and control stations, things like that. So I see much of this as a culmination of the Nazi prophecy. And some years ago, there was a aerospace writer for Jane's Defense Weekly that did a study on the Pentagon's black budget, the secret budget, and he looked for the origins of it, and he discovered it was brought over with these Nazis that came over after the war. And he asked the question, was there an ideological contamination that came along with these Nazis as well? And I think the answer is clearly yes. So I think we have to really see all of this as part of a fascist effort in this country. And I don't think we can run away from that idea and those words because this is what we've become. Mussolini defined fascism as the wedding of corporations and government. And that's certainly what we have today.
Did you have a question? Also? Yeah. Okay, I'd like, we'll have these two gentlemen, and then I'd like to say something, and then we can wrap it up. Yeah.
Thank you. In hopefully less than 60 seconds. First of all, there was a mention made of March 4th, 50 years ago. There's a new book out by the MIT Press called March 4th, which might be worth having a look at. Secondly, napalm was mentioned. Just for anybody in the room who may not already know, napalm was invented by a chemistry professor at Harvard University and was first tested at Harvard Stadium. The other day, I was in Darwin's coffee shop on Cambridge Street in Cambridge and saw a little card, please no nuclear bombers in Vermont. The U.S. Air Force is planning to base its newest nuclear weapons delivery system in Vermont. We don't want any part of it. And sign the resolution canbvt.org. And I want to end with a question for anybody on the panel who might care to speak to it, which is, what is your understanding of the contribution that Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange made to the topics that are being discussed here tonight? Thank you.
Let's hear his question.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
This guy.
Okay. So I guess my question kind of ties into the drone strike talk, and I guess it felt like it tied back to the data that we're leaking. And so how do we slow the leakage of this data? I mean, a lot of it's coming from corporations that maybe work with the government. Some of it's directly the government surveillance. How do we slow the surveillance state, and how do we fund that? Because people want the data to target. The data is useful. So how do we fight against the collection of that data? And do you think that's the answer to this, or do you think the answer is not using the data because others might be using it if we're not?
I think there are two parts to this. One is that at MIT, there's research that goes on that isn't specifically said to be weapons related. For example, and this thing about Media Lab and their technology to sense people's mood or their intentions. When they list all the things about this in the MIT press statement that are good, the first thing they start out with is, this will help advertising. They never say it will help the military. But the question is, if you're already into manipulating people's behaviors, isn't that wrong? And so when you look at the array of artificial intelligence, which may not be immediately related to this, you have to ask, what's the downside of it? And that's something that I think in this particular case, the Media Lab people chose definitely not to talk about. There's a DARPA project here called Red Balloon. And what they did was to challenge engineering schools to find 10 red balloons that would be put up around the country. And so through social media and an incentive program of money, sort of like a pyramid scheme, the MIT team won. The DARPA thought this might go on for a week, 2 weeks. MIT team solved it in 9 hours and identified the location of every balloon. But when you read about that project on Wikipedia, you see that shortly after that, the State Department used the same scheme to find people of interest. And so that was the entry point. And so this whole thing of what choices are made has to do initially with, to my mind, are we using AI to manipulate people? And then the next step is, are we connecting it with weapons? And so I think it's a very big challenge to scientists to think through what they're being called on to do. And if the money comes from DARPA, which is part of the Pentagon, even though the idea is to find red balloons, you have to understand that that money is going to lead to killing and repression at some point. And I also want to say, in terms of people in the drone program, we have had people who have been struck by conscience who have come forward and said, we refuse to fly drones anymore. We also know that drone pilots are under a lot of emotional and time pressure, and the military is constantly trying to find how to keep people in this program. So there's a heavy moral burden that a lot of these people are carrying with them, and it's called moral injury. It's now become something that's treated as a condition. So these are all things that are happening with people who are directly involved with killing people on a daily, weekly, monthly basis within our own society. And we have to realize that, as with a death camp in Germany, we have people being called on to slaughter people around the country in 27 bases all the time. And so it's a question of conscience, not only for engineering people, but for religious people, other people who are concerned about mental health, that kind of thing. So I think those are areas that need to be called into play when we're talking about, can we stop this? And I think people now are feeling like, well, we have to stop or we're all going to die. And so there's a little oomph to that. But it's important to know that there are people within this system who are very, very concerned about what they're doing, and they need support.
Just on the question of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, those two, like Snowden, seem to me unquestionably heroes. They risk their lives. When you see the Snowden movie, Citizen 4, and the one Snowden, you think this is unbelievable what this person managed to do. And it would be wonderful to hope that every day somebody would turn and give information like that. But we have to realize two things. First of all, they literally risk their lives in doing it. Second of all, we have enough information to act. Yeah, it's true that if we had complete information, we'd be able to act better. But we have to act with incomplete information, and we have more than enough to go forward. So we have to take some steps and not hope that each day other heroes will come forward.
We've heard very clearly that the war machine is bipartisan, and we can't let these politicians get away with that. We need to be dogging them and going to them when they're out there campaigning and demanding that they explain what their stand is on war, what their stand is on the military budget, what their stand is on these issues of where our priorities are. And we need to be challenging them and constantly. And the thing that's the most galling is when they say, when someone makes proposals for social things that would fill social needs or be for peace or be for the climate, they say, like the Green New Deal or whatever, we don't have the money. Where would the money? This is totally impractical. Where would the money come from? We know where the money would come from. We've been talking about it all night. The money would come from those billions and trillions that are going to war. So we need to keep saying we've got the money. It's what we don't have is the money going in the right place. And we need to keep demanding constantly and trying to get publicity about it to be able to say, this, we have the money, we need to have the people have to take the power back. And that's what we need to do to end these horrible wars and conditions.